Well, welcome everybody to the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. I recognize most of you. Some of you I might not recognize, but that may be my fault. We meet here on the second Wednesday of every month at 7:30, except during the summer. This room is not air conditioned. That's one of the reasons. And we take a little hiatus in the summer, but keep an eye on Meetup. So does everybody here know that we have a presence on meetup.com? So Meetup is the place to find out about what's going on. Without further ado, there's been a lot of it so far, knee-deep in ado. Dr. Bill Zingrone has given this particular talk several times before to other secular groups, and according to him, it always generates a great deal of interest and discussion. Having had him as a speaker here a few times in the past, I can attest to the fact that the discussion is often lively and engaging, and he's one of our favorite people to have in front of our audience here. Dr. Zingrone is a lecturer in developmental psychology with passionate research interests in consciousness and cognitive evolution. His driving motivation is to dispel outdated religious-based ideas about human nature that are ingrained in the folk beliefs of our modern culture. Our uniquely human consciousness and cognitive abilities may be the result of our two-handed competence with regards to manufacture of stone tools, which mediated the evolution of our unprecedented conceptual abilities. The new Enlightenment, secular humanist movement, is the hope of the human race to end the tyranny of traditional religious thought. So that last sentence, I suspect, is something we can all passionately agree with. Without further ado, you can't have a microphone. Dr. Bill Zingrone. Thanks.
I want to thank you guys, Humanists of West Suburban Chicago, for having me back again. I spoke here probably a year and a half ago. I was working downstate most of last year, and I'm back home in McHenry County. I live in Crystal Lake, teach at McHenry County College. I did give a version of this talk to the Quad City Humanists, the Springfield Humanists, and the Peoria Humanists when I was working downstate near Peoria, Galesburg. So I did get a chance to get out a little bit. Really nice group of folks down there as well. So what I'm going to talk about is how I think our consciousness may have evolved and how our concepts evolve. And they all have to do with the fact that we made very complex tools that started to require concepts like symmetry and equality and things like that, things that we don't see in any other animal. And I think that mediates our consciousness. And I'll get into all that. So on the front slide, you've got some very symmetric bilaterally symmetric stone tools from the left there. They're only about 500,000 years old and less. Then I've got the Taj Mahal in the middle, mainly because it's an example of the type of things humans can make. And it demonstrates about 4 different layers of symmetry in that picture, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And both of those are produced by that highly evolved primate brain over on the right there. That the human brain is evolved rather differently than other animals. We are in many ways an off-the-rack mammal primate. We use the same neurotransmitters and neurons as a fruit fly, but in many other ways, we have some very unique wiring structures, et cetera, that I think are part of what mediate our consciousness. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. It does. Hey, okay. So here's the things I'm going to try and make a case for tonight. That we have concepts. Animals don't. Animals have perceptual categories that I'll talk about.
I mean, you mean non-human animals?
Pardon me?
You mean non-human animals?
Non-human animals. So our conceptual ability, I think, evolved through manufacture of complex tools like this. I'm going to pass this around later so you can get a good look at it. This is a recreated artifact, and not from simple tools like this. It took this type of symmetry and detailed manufacture in order to get to our conceptual level. And our unique conscious experience that we wake up to every day, and I'm going to talk about this quite a bit, is based on the concepts of objects, people, animals, and events, with ourselves moving through that world model in our head, both in space and time. And again, that's something we do, and there's no evidence any other animal does. The standard view is that what made us uniquely human is our social interactions. I think that's completely backwards. I think social interactions came last, and we use our concepts to have the incredible social language and culture that we have, but the concepts came first. Last but not least, conscious may not be inevitable. It required a lot of very multiple and contingent steps over about 3 million years of human evolution. And without those steps, I don't think I'd be standing here talking to you guys. So, wrong way, I gotta learn to use this thing here. So here's what I think is different from humans and animals. One of the things. Animals categorize on perceptual similarity. A dog can certainly tell a dog from a cat, and he'll act very differently to other dogs than he will to a cat. He'll chase the cat, but he'll immediately go into dominance behavior if he meets another dog. And he does it by sight, does it by smell, etc. And he can certainly tell a human is not a dog, etc. But does your dog have a concept of wolf or jackal, or if he sees a big four-legged animal, does he have a concept of horse separate from cow, separate from zebra, separate from whatever? I would say probably not. It's excellent perceptual abilities that I'll show you can produce an awful lot of behaviors that we kind of take for granted. They don't have to think like we do in order to do their complex behaviors. So humans build on those perceptual categories, and it actually starts in infancy. And I'm a developmental psychologist. My field is cognitive development. So I'm using other researchers' advances in that in the last 20, 30 years to kind of make the case for this stuff. Just as an aside, I also use an awful lot of archaeology, a lot of comparative psychology, the consciousness literature. I've read most of the consciousness researchers, etc., etc. So I'm really trying to do a multidisciplinary synthetic approach to this whole thing. So infants are wired to build concepts using spatial movement and force abstractions. That's something that's been discovered in the last 20, 30 years. And here's how they do it. When you look at Mom and Big Sister and Kitty there, the child starts to categorize them or conceptualize them as living things. And the ball and the bottle on the other side are non-living things. And the way they do it is by what moves and what doesn't and how they react. We used to think kids, understood a chair first and a dog and a cup, and then went to higher categories. It's actually the other way around. One of the first things they learn is living versus non-living, such as people and animals versus objects. So what makes it different? Well, it's based on spatial relations and forces. So for example, living things move by themselves, right? Mama and Kitty come in and out of the room, right? And they also react. If you pick up Kitty by the tail, Kitty reacts, and you find that one out real soon, early in life. And baby sister reacts if you poke her in the eye, and Mama hugs you back. But whatever you do to your ball and your bottle, they don't do anything. And when you throw your ball and your bottle, it'll be sitting there the next day you come back in the room. They don't move under their own power, and they don't react. Living things do. So one of the first things infants by 9, 12 months categorize, or conceptualize rather, and they use perceptual categorization as well. That's part of our brains too. It didn't go away, okay? Is they conceptualize based on spatial and forced metaphors. So I'm going to be looking for that in the human evolution record. So a lot of what this is taking what we know from the development of cognition and saying, okay, if this is how it develops, can we look for any evidence of that in how things evolved and maybe make some sense out of human evolution? So the first concepts in both development and evolution may be spatial and force relations. So now we'll talk about consciousness. I promised that define what perception and conceptualization is different here. Those things overlap horribly in the literature. People take a concept and a category, smash them together. So at least for me, perceptual categorization is something animals do based on similarity of how things smell and look like. Conceptualization is a whole different thing that humans do based on unobservable relations. Okay? So now we'll talk about consciousness and how I'm going to define it for this talk. William James, many of you know, psychologist from the 1890s, wrote the Principles of Psychology. He's the first person that really identified and expanded on the stream of consciousness, which is the sense of you being an agent in your continuing narrative of your life. You wake up every morning, depending on how much you had to drink the night before, I suppose, but most mornings you wake up knowing who you are, where you are, what day it is, how old you are, and what you're going to do next. So the alarm clock goes off, which nobody uses alarm clocks anymore, so you use one of these things, right? And you look at it, and you go, it's 8:30. Oh, I got to get to work. I got to go get my whatever. Gee, I forgot to get gas in the car last night. I won't have time to get gas. You know, your brain starts doing that planning ahead stuff, and you do it all day long, and you do it really most of your entire life. And you move forward in time in your own thoughts, creating future memories. You also go backwards in time and think about what you did last night, last year. You have something we call episodic memories, which are the events in your life, okay, that are unique to you. And to be able to make an event alone, I think, is a unique human ability. And one of the things that's also unique is we can move back and forth in time through our memories. You know, so if I say to all of you here, what was the name of your 5th grade teacher? Some of you may not have thought of that for many moons, but most of you can go, well, I'll do it and go. I was at St. Mary's grade school in Woodstock, and I thought it was Mrs. Calhoun, but it wasn't. That was 4th grade. It was Sister Daniel Mary. I mean, whatever, right? You can go back into your memories and auto-recall and do auto-cue recall, search for things. Okay, and that's a big part of your daily consciousness. You're constantly planning ahead and doing things. You know, as James at first really identified that. So what's going on in your head? I'm saying there's this conceptually driven, constructed model. You're making a model of the outside world based on your perceptions. And you take your perceptions and then conceptualize from them. You add on another layer of description and thinking that I don't think the animals do. I call it a constructed model because you build it through child development. Some consciousness researchers that I greatly admire call it a controlled hallucination, okay? That you hallucinate everything and you have no idea what's outside. I think that's inaccurate because there are times when you do hallucinate, when you think a dog is standing right there and there's no dog there, okay? But most of the time, you're doing a constructed model and it's pretty coherent, pretty predictive. It does a nice job, okay? And you cut the world up into objects and people and events, okay? And that happens in the first 5 years of life. Much of it in the first year, but things like events take another year or two. It takes about 2 years for you to recognize yourself in a mirror. So your self-concept builds in pieces, okay? It isn't there automatically at birth, and I don't think it develops in other animals. We occupy the cognitive niche, okay? Our skill as an animal in the world is we go out into any environment and solve problems, figure out how to live, clothe ourselves, eat what's there to eat, build shelters, whatever. And we've populated every continent except Antarctica. We do have stations there, but there's no cities or towns or villages. It's the only continent we couldn't pull off living on. And I also think that our conceptual consciousness that we run with every day of the week, okay, evolved only in us, the bipedal primate. And it took some very contingent steps. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't such a magical genetic thing that all of a sudden we were consciousness and as smart as we are today. It took a lot of years, many years. So that's what I'm going to try and make the case for. What comes first here? Oh, I'm going to go to this. Here's the archaeology part of it. Lucy's hand is superimposed on a human hand there. Most of you know who Lucy is, Australopithecus afarensis from about 3.3 million years ago. There's no evidence Lucy made tools, but she did already have a human hand, not a primate hand. She could make a baton grip. She was probably using a digging stick and doing some other manual skills, but the brain hadn't started to expand yet. About 2.8 million years ago, you get these first very simple stone tools where somebody takes one rock and knocks a couple pieces off it, and you have very sharp flakes that you can butcher animals with. You can work wood with it. You can scrape hides, and then you have this chopper that you can actually butcher and break bones and ligaments apart. I butchered a chicken with this one. Don't worry, I cleaned it, because I am going to pass this around so you can take a look at this. But these are very simple. There's not a lot of conceptual knowledge to this, okay? So this didn't get us there. And you don't get any symmetry in tools that is an unobservable concept, okay, that only we can do, right? Until about 500,000 years ago. So we went almost 2.5 million years with very simple tools, and they did the job. We could butcher, they took the place of our fangs, we lost our big canines, we've got slim and graceful. We're not, the toughest animal out there by any means, but with these tools we could feed ourselves and make spears and do all kinds of things. But you don't really see anything complex conceptually till about 500,000 years ago. It takes another 500,000 years before you get cave art, okay? And I'm going to try and explain why I think when that happened. So you have the symmetric tools up in the upper left. Those are about 500,000 years old, very similar to this one I'm going to pass around so you can look at it. Then you have cave art starting around 40,000 years ago. And if you look at that diagram of both the horse there, okay, it actually shows some symmetry. There's equal spacing and equal lines, okay? That takes some symmetric skill in your brain. And then you get symmetry in all kinds of tools, like harpoons, flutes, that I'm going to show you in a little bit. You get notation, like that inscribed plaque in the lower right. We think that that's a notation from about 18,000 years ago, and we think it maybe somebody was tracking the phases of the moon. You'll notice it's very symmetric, equal elements, equal spaces. And bows and arrows don't show up until 12 to 20,000 years ago. A theory of process that I'll explain later, where we figure out how things work and how things go, and we take that kind of attitude looking at things. And full-blown culture really doesn't show up until after 20,000 years ago. So our cognitive evolution has been a 3 million year process. Brain expansion started about 1.8 million, 2 million years ago, and we made simple tools for another 1 million years. Then we got the conceptual tools, brain expansion again. We were at modern sizes by about 200,000 years ago, and then it still takes another 150,000 years before we see cave art, and another 20, 30,000 years before we see bows and arrows and symmetric flutes and harpoons. So it didn't all happen at once, and it happened in really interesting increments. So that's the archaeology of it. I want to talk a little bit about unconscious processing, because a lot of the animal research automatically assumes if an animal does something, he must be thinking just like us. And if anything, of all my reading over the last 20, 30 years, we can do a lot of things without conscious control. So for one thing, when you perceive something, if you look across this room, you automatically see the color, the shape, and the movement of things. You don't consciously say, well, I'm just going to look at color right now, and I'll look at shape in a minute. No, it automatically gets processed by your brain outside of your conscious control. Your eye movements. All of you in this room, your eyes move 50, 60 times a minute. You make tiny little saccades of your eyes, little ballistic movements. Your eyes are constantly shifting in your visual field, okay? It's rare you're ever fixated just straight ahead, okay? But none of that is under conscious control. So who's moving your eyes? It's not you, not your conscious self, but your brain is doing it for you quite unconsciously. Reach and grasp. I usually, I can make enough noise, I'm sure. I always show my students when I'm talking about unconscious processing, is if I reach over to get this rock, okay, my right parietal lobe has a body map and keeps track of where my hands are in extrapersonal space. It's getting constant feedback from my joints and such. And I can reach over, grab the rock, put it back down, make the proper grip, hundreds of muscles and half a dozen joints involved, all without any conscious control. My parietal lobe runs that for me, okay? And if that was a coffee cup, I would have come at it like this and made a coffee cup grip instead of a pincer grip, okay? None of that do I plan. If I had to plan all that and go, okay, let's see, the rock is about this big, and I need to cock my elbow and move my shoulder. You'd never get anything done, right? This is all automatic and unconscious. I got footfalls up there. You know, how many times have you stepped off the escalator and your body thought there was another step and you either hit too hard or you overstepped, right? Your brain is running all that stuff for you. So what I want to say is animals can do an awful lot of very complex looking behaviors that we would say they must be thinking, and that's probably not true, okay? How many of you know who Michio Kaku is, the physicist? He's a science educator, great guy to have around. He thinks snakes are conscious, and I wrote a blog saying, stick to your physics, pals. I'm a developmental psychologist. I don't tell you how quantum physics works, so, stay out of the consciousness stuff. But anyway, so how does the snake get that mouse? Does he have to think about it? Ooh, I'm hungry, let's go have lunch, right? No. The snake slithers along the ground. He's got terrible vision, but he's got infrared pits on the top of his head, and he detects heat. Usually in his environment, if he detects heat down at that level, it's a small rodent or rabbit or something that he can eat. So he strikes, right? And he pumps his venom, and the thing, gets paralyzed. Well, then he's got to swallow it, and he usually can't swallow the rear end of an animal. He can't get it passed in. So he's always got to go around the head end and pull the head and then the shoulders in so he can swallow the animal. Well, he doesn't see very well, okay? But he's got an incredible sense of smell, and he can smell ass just like we can. So he figures out that's the wrong end of the animal, and that's how he finds the head end of the animal. Not by sight, not by, oh, that's the rear end, a thought. No, just by pure perception alone. Goes around the head end and starts to swallow. Now, 99% of the time, that gets in the meal and it works fine. But you're out hiking somewhere where there's mountain rattlers or diamondbacks or something, and this thing on the side of the trail detects heat from your leg, reaches out, and nails you. And it's a lose-lose for both. He's not going to get a meal. He can't even get your big toe in his mouth or get over your boot. He's not going to get a meal. Why the hell did he reach out and strike? Because all he's doing is stimulus response, responding to heat. He's got a perception going. There's no thought of, ooh, gee, I'll nail this hiker just to piss him off, maybe he'll die. There's nothing like that going on. So everything the snake does, and I contend most animals, is all perception driven. There's no conceptual representation, no evidence of it, no evidence of thinking, and there's none required. There's no conscious reflection required. One of the researchers you might meet in a video in a few minutes, who works with chimps, he's kind of the pariah of the animal behavior group, and he says you can't assume any animal psychology is like our own, and that's an assumption we make a lot. Okay, let's see if I can this way. There we go. Sam Harris, that many of you know, the secular author, had an excellent blog a few years ago called "Is a Starfish Conscious?" Okay, and it went on for days and pages. It was excellent. And so, question, is a starfish conscious? I'll let Lewis Black answer that, no, okay? And I put Gomer there just because, like, Shazam, okay, right? And I'm going to talk about the starfish nervous system and why I don't think starfish are conscious, couldn't mediate conscious, and there's no need for it either. They run on perceptual stuff. And I put the guy in the lower right, that's Descartes, right? And you all know Descartes from dualism and stuff. The only philosophy joke I know, I gotta tell you, Descartes walks into a bar. Anybody know this joke? Descartes walks into a bar, and the bartender says, "Would you like a beer?" And he says, "I think not," and he disappeared. Right? So, I'm gonna cue you now and say Descartes walks into a bar, and you say, "I think not." Okay. Grab this thing. So, here's the starfish nervous system. There's no brain. It doesn't mean that they have a cephalic ganglion, which is a bundle of neurons in the head end of an animal when you don't really have, differentiated lobes of a brain yet, okay? It has kind of a nerve net, and it's got nerves and neurons that go out to each arm, and it can sense food and move toward it. It can sense it's upright or not, and it flips back over, so it's in that position where its stomach is facing down, because that's how it eats things. It crawls over things and actually extends its stomach out its cloaca type hole that does everything for it, and dissolves whatever it's eating, and then gets its nutrients. It has light-dark receptors at the end of each radial arm, and each radial arm can regenerate, right? So it can do some real interesting behaviors: crawl along the seafloor, find a dead animal or fish, crawl over it, dissolve it, eat it. Okay. But does the starfish know or think to itself, gee, I just lost another arm, that's the third one I had to regrow this year. Good thing I'm in kind of dark with the gender. Do I think anything like that is going on in the nerve net of the starfish? Is the starfish concept conscious? Cue Descartes? No, I think not. Okay. So what's different about the human brain? You know, I don't have time to get into animal brains, I would love to, but we'll see how far we get with this thing. We have 85 billion, we used to say 100 billion neurons, they revised it to 85. Lately I've been hearing 86. They've been coming up with some really clever ways to count and get a more accurate count of our neurons. And they have about 1,000 connections each in that 2.5 pounds of jelly you have floating in your cerebrospinal fluid in your head. To get an idea how many neurons that is, I tell my classes, you know, if you want to count to 85 billion, how long would it take you if you said, you know, count neurons in a brain? 1, 2, 3, and you did that 24/7, 365 days a year. How long would it take you? About 2,700 years. That's just to count your neurons, okay? To count the connections, they each have 1,000 to 10,000 connections each. It would take you 3 million years to try and count all the synapses in your brain. And even that wouldn't capture the connection, the complexity, because you have hierarchical spots of two different things, they're interconnected. We're not even talking about the axons that connect different parts of the brain. And it's not just a big mammal or primate brain. It's 3 times larger than a chimp, but it'll also have different structures. That's new knowledge too. Up to about 10 years ago, everybody thought, well, visual cortex at the back of the brain that we first really discovered in the 60s. A couple guys won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how your visual cortex worked. They did it with cats. Everybody thought, well, visual cortex, that's the same in all animals. Turns out human visual cortex is wired differently than a chimp's. So even in basic perceptual processing, we're not just a big chimp brain or just a big primate or mammal brain. Our brains are different. We also have hundreds of genes that are expressed in our brains that are not expressed in chimp brains. We have rewired connections, so we have connections between areas that are 4 or 5 times as large as chimps. We have larger frontal lobes, parietal lobes, and then we have some unique neurons in certain areas of the brain. The chimps might have 1 or 2 of them in a column, and we've got 20, and they're wired differently. So we've found out just in the last 10, 20 years how different our brains really are. We're not just a big primate brain, it's a very different brain. Okay? So we also know consciousness is mediated by our brains. Okay? You can have somebody in a coma, if their brain is damaged enough, they don't have any arousal at all, and they don't go through sleep-wake cycles that are usually mediated by the lower centers. Or somebody can be in a vegetative state. Again, no consciousness, but they do arouse, they may open their eyes, they may even track objects, and they do go through sleep-wake cycles, but there's no response, no cognition. The person isn't there, the consciousness is lost. We can destroy consciousness or mediate it through anesthesia. Sleep is an altered form of consciousness. It's very different than your waking consciousness. Hallucinogens can cause changes in consciousness, so can meditation. And an interesting one, whenever I read some philosophy that says that consciousness, will never be explained by the neurons in the brain, one of the interesting things you can do is you can actually screw with your own perceptual stuff. And you can do this rubber hand illusion where you have somebody, you put a rubber hand you get at the magic shop, a whole arm, you set it on a table, and then you have the person put their real hand right under it, okay? Then you reach across and you take one hand and you scratch their real arm and you do the same pattern. So you go scratch, scratch, tap, 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 scratch, and you do the same thing in the rubber arm. So you're getting conflicting input into the person's brain. They're feeling, they know their arm is being touched, but they can't see it. They see the visual input is that you're doing it in this hand that's not their hand, but it's almost in the same orientation. Within about a minute, your perception flips, and you start to feel the sensation in the rubber hand. Okay? So you can actually muck with conscious perception with something like that. It's in the brain.
Then you hit it with a hammer.
Huh?
Then you hit it with a hammer.
Yeah, then the guy, you've seen those videos and the guy freaks out. Somebody comes over and goes, they hit him with the hammer, and the guy, so it's pretty amazing. Okay. Now, some people say, well, you know, neurons aren't conscious, how can they possibly produce consciousness? Well, it's an emergent property. Any single neuron is not conscious, but 85 billion of them in a human brain wired in the right, unique way produces the consciousness we have. And just like a single molecule of water is not wet, you need a couple billion of them, or whatever the exact number is. So it's an emergent property, billions of neurons intercollected in elaborate functional hierarchies that I think uniquely evolved in us. And it's more than just connections. Some of the computational consciousness guys that have a mathematical background say, well, consciousness is just a certain information level. When you hit a certain information level, that's consciousness, okay? And I think they're missing the boat. So billions of neurons alone don't make consciousness. They gotta be wired up in the right way, okay? So a whole bunch of transistors on a chip, we keep building bigger and bigger computers, and some of the AI guys will tell you, oh, they're gonna suddenly, poof, turn conscious one day. It's not how it's gonna work, okay? So just a lot of neurons by themselves or transistors on a chip don't produce consciousness. It's a very complex way of wiring different situations, etc., and the concepts that they mediate, okay? Sam Harris goes on a little further and talks about a Cocker Spaniel, okay? You don't have much problem saying a starfish probably doesn't have any consciousness, but most people will say, yeah, but my dog is conscious. I say your dog is aware, your dog is aware, awake, and alert, and he certainly feels pain. He has incredible social cognition skills. Dogs are amazing, okay? But I don't think he has any conceptual consciousness. He can do everything he does just on perceptions alone. Your dog is out in the backyard and those ears are cocked to sounds, and he picks up the sound of a squirrel rustling over there, and then he picks up the smell of something, and he goes along the foundation of your house, and he sniffs out some baby rabbits that are a foot down in a hole that none of us could see or hear, but he could hear it, and then he finds it by sense of smell, and that's how he gets his food, okay? And I don't think your dog is sitting there thinking, well, next Tuesday my owner's taking me to the vet. I hate it when that happens. He always waves the frisbee, and I think we're going to the park, and then he takes me in for my damn shots, right? So I don't think your dog has any of the concepts that could run these thoughts. I'm rusty, I'm son of Rex, I have heartworms, we'll go to the vet next Tuesday. I don't think he knows what a Tuesday is. I'm 70 in dog years, and that really sucks, right? So Q Descartes, I think not. Why do we think this way, though? Well, there's two reasons. We tend to anthropomorphize with pretty much everything. We tend to ascribe our psychology to other things. We've been doing it for millennia. And we live in a Disney culture. This is wild. When I ask my students, how many of you have seen The Godfather? Right? That's pretty old now. That's 70s. Maybe 2 out of 30. And then I'll ask, who's seen, I don't know, I'll pick an almost famous, a rock movie that's about 10 years old. I haven't seen that either. Culture is changing so fast, okay? You got to go to a movie that's 3 years old for my 18 to 20-year-old students to have seen it. Anything else, you know, their culture is saturated with other stuff, right? But then if I go, how many of you have seen Bambi? Right? Bambi came out when? Late 50s, early 60s, right? They've all seen it. You know, maybe one kid. And then you go down the list, Aladdin and Lion King, and Frozen that my granddaughters watch. And those guys are geniuses at marketing. Oh my God. We live in a Disney culture. So since we were 8 months old, we've been seeing animals talk and think and react. And so we're saturated with this. So it's easy to go, oh, well, dog thinks just like I do. You know? So the other thing is we ascribe agency to things, and that starts to develop about 4 or 5 years old. That's when your kids start seeing monsters in the closet, or there's a monster under the bed, they hear a sound, you know, the heating vents are creaking because the heat turned on, and it sounds like somebody walking down the hall, the kid runs into your room, there's a monster coming to get me, right? They ascribe agency. There must be a human-like, person-like cause to things. All our early religions are full of gods for everything. Gods for the wind, gods for the rain, gods for the volcano, right? And people then find natural explanations that no, there's no person, agent behind the wind. Zeus is not creating thunderstorms and throwing the lightning bolts at anybody. So we have this tendency Okay? So it's very easy for us, even in the animal psychology literature, to automatically assume, well, if they do behavior X, they must be thinking like us. And I think that's a huge mistake. Here's some examples. I'm not going to do these videos because we just don't have time, but you can look up, I'll give you these slides later, you can look up any of these YouTube videos, and there's plenty of these where you have a dog barking at a statue of a guy on a park bench, and he's trying to get the guy to throw the stick, and he keeps dropping the stick in his lap, and the dog can't figure out, why doesn't this guy throw the stick? And they're like, dogs are very clever. Their social cognition skills are amazing. How can this dog be fooled, right? Well, maybe that's all a human being is to him, is that perceptual shape, okay? That's all it is. He doesn't have a concept of live or dead, or breathing, or human, or any of that. It's just that shape and look. Another one is Jokro is a video by some Japanese researchers looking at chimps in West Africa. And the chimp mother has got a baby that's sick. And they're following this chimp troop. They come back to the same place to crack nuts day after day. So you watch this video, and you can tell the little chimp is sick. And it gets pretty cold at night there, so they get a call. Well, this chimp stops nursing. And it's a little baby chimp about this big, and it's next to mom, or on her chest, or on her back, 24/7 for about the first 5 years of life, okay? But they never look one another in the eye. They're totally different than humans. Chimps and monkeys never make eye contact, okay? They cling to mom, and they need her attachment. She feeds them, but there's no human-like communication whatsoever, okay? People don't know that unless you watch them in the wild. So the little baby chimp is next to him, and you can kind of see the things looking sickly, the hair's falling out. And the mom is there, and the big sister, and they're all feeding and looking straight ahead. Chimps don't share food either. They move in groups, but they eat solitary, right? They don't share any food. And the little 2-year-old chimp keels over, boom, right, passes out. And nobody makes a move, they keep eating. And I ask my students, how is that different than humans? And they're all like, well, humans would be sitting at a table, mom and big sister and the baby would be facing each other, and if the baby keeled over in the high chair, right, you'd be pretty concerned and check it out. The chimps are completely nonplussed, ignore it. And 10 minutes later, the mom just picks up the lifeless chimp, throws it on her back, and goes for a walk. They come back a day or two later, and you can see the baby chimp is dead. It's lifeless, there's no life. She lays it down on the ground, they all keep eating. One chimp comes over and kind of sniffs it. She picks it up, throws it on her back, goes away. They come back after about 4 days. Now the thing is bloating, right? Because the bacteria inside are causing gases. And the chimp researchers in the blind, they're about 50 yards away, and you can see it's a telephoto lens, okay? Because they got to be far enough away they don't make any sound or smells that the chimps can tell they're being watched and stuff. And the guys in the blind are like, we can smell the roadkill from here, 50 yards away. Right there, it must be absolutely putrid. All the chimps are eating away, totally nonplussed. One goes over and picks the maggots off the body, and she carries the chimp around for about 2 weeks. Finally, the thing is this desiccated, dried out thing, the jaw falls off, and she's still carrying it around like it's an infant. But then the infant hasn't been nursing for about 2 weeks. So when nursing stops, those lactating hormones stop, and the chimp, the mother chimp, goes back into estrus, okay? And she starts touching herself, and you can see fluids and stuff. She's back in heat, and she drops the baby like a sack of potatoes, because the nurturing hormones are done, okay? No conception of life, death, sickness, love, none of that, okay? So we get a Disney version of animal behavior from TV and stuff, and when you watch the real thing in the wild, you get a very, very different view. I won't talk about the others because I want to get further past this, but you read about these. The other one I want to talk about is Harry Harlow did work with rhesus monkeys on attachment. And primates need that mother attachment. They really do. If they don't get it, they end up very socially awkward and afraid to explore their environment stuff. But they raised this monkey on a fake mother, and she's just a wire mother with a terry cloth body and flashlight parts for a face. So it's this fixed face. And when you show it to my students, I go, how can they be fooled? It's, it doesn't move. It's not a real monkey mom, yet this little infant gets normal attachment from this fake doll mom. Why? Because that's all a monkey mom is to him, is the creature comfort. He never looks her in the face anyways. Okay, so the fact that it's immobile flashlight parts means nothing. It's in the right general perceptual form, and it's warm, and he gets his full attachment. Okay, so there's all kinds of examples I give you from the animal literature that don't square with the idea that, oh, they think and have concepts just like us. I don't think so. Deer in the headlights, I'll mention that one, right? You're driving along the highway at night, you see the deer on the side of the road, and you're thinking, don't walk out in front of me. And what does the deer do? Walks across the road, and then freezes right in the middle road, and you're like, what? How can you be so stupid? It's not. It has no concept that there's a 4,000-pound automobile coming at it at 60 miles an hour. Deer evolved in the woods, and when they hear a strange sound, what usually saves them is they freeze. If they hear something weird, they freeze, and usually a predator then can't see them in the woods, and they hold that pose for a minute or two. If they don't hear any other sounds, they might risk moving. If they hear another sound, they'll bolt. Okay? So freezing is their perceptual response to odd sounds, and that usually saves their neck in their normal environment. They did not evolve in roadways and cars, which have only been around, making roadkill for less than 100 years. Okay? So, this is a guy named Dan Polvinelli. I've read 2 of his books, read all his research. He talks about the fact that his research shows animals don't have unobservable concepts like human kids do, okay? And things like weight, support, contact, containment, propulsion. 3-year-old humans have them, but not chimps, okay? And Scott, if you can hit the YouTube video, we'll watch just about a minute or 2 of this, and this will give you a real feel of what really goes on. Yeah, there it is. This is Alan Alda in the Human Spark video, so if you hit it, you can make it full screen.
Okay, so this is Apollo.
Hey, Apollo.
So I've come to the University of Louisiana to visit a research facility well known for stumping chimpanzees.
If it's a heavy one, he's supposed to put it in the tray on his right.
Very good.
The man who runs this lab and who believes his experiments prove chimps' minds are very different from ours is Danny Pavanelli.
So it was heavy and he put it in the blue tray.
That's right.
The chimps have been looked after since they were babies by Anthony Rideau. Danny calls Anthony the chimp whisperer because of his rapport with the animals. But even Anthony takes no chances with security, for which I'm about to be very grateful.
Okay, so now this time it's a light object, and he can't know that until he picks it up. Oh, he got it off.
Nope, sorry. Try it.
That's what I call an exit.
Apollo obviously needs a break, and so he's replaced for the moment by Megan and her new baby.
Very good. Very good. Good girl.
She just got the white wolf rack. Schedule calls for her to get the heavy one now, and see if she knows what to do. Okay, so Megan's going to come in. It's a heavy object.
Megan had a lot of practice sorting heavy and light objects, and she needed it.
Good job, Megan.
It takes them hundreds of trials. On average, it took our chimps about 800 trials to learn how to sort reliably just this first set of objects. And then you give it a new set, and a new set.
And the second set, would that take fewer trials?
It takes them fewer trials, like maybe 400.
And at what point, how many times do they have to go through this before they get the idea that you can generalize about heavy and light?
Well, I don't think they ever get the idea that you can generalize about heavy and light. I think eventually what happens is that their bodies become sensitive instruments to heaviness and lightness, and so their bodies know what to do with the objects.
How does that differ from us? I mean, how do we know that we don't have that same signal from our bodies that we interpret as heavy or light?
Well, we do, and that's the fascinating thing about studying the similarities and differences between chimps. It's because most of the time, I think we're acting pretty much like chimps. The humans didn't discard the old chimp-like or ape-like way of understanding the world. We wove into our minds these additional high-level concepts. Hey, buddy, look at this. This is going to be fun. Come on. Let's go. Look, let me show you. Why don't you grab this right here? Let me show you where this one goes. This one goes right there. All righty. Let me show you where this one goes. Yeah, go ahead, grab it. There it goes. That's right. That's right.
This is interesting. He immediately sensed it was different
That's right.
and would probably go in the other one.
That's right.
He's never done this before.
No, but there's two options, and I think already at this age 3, they're already beginning to see this as a problem to be solved.
So there's dozens of studies like this. I've been reading this literature for a decade or two. And chimps never get it, okay? It's like they don't get the concept of something. They can do some interesting imitation. But like he said, it takes them 800 trials, 800 training sessions to get the chimp to maybe sort the objects 80% of the time. And if you wait 6 months, you probably have to retrain the chimp, okay? And it doesn't generalize to any other task, okay? They're probably doing it on perception. He has no concept of weight. Another one is contact or containment that your 1-year-old is already starting to get, okay? And a trick we do or an experiment we do in developmental psych is we put a 3-4-year-old in front of a table and we put a toy out there that he can't reach. And then you give him a couple sticks. You give him a straight stick or like a toy golf club, and then you give him a rake. And the kid tries to bring the toy in with the stick, doesn't work. He tries the golf club and it slips off. So then you show him, you grab the rake, you reach out, you put the tines down, you contain the entire object, and you even put some force on it and bring the thing in. One try, your 3-year-old's got it. He'll never get it wrong again. Bring him back 6 months later, he'll grab the rake, he'll even imitate your posture, and he'll put the tines down. Without you telling him any of that trick, he just imitates it, okay? Now put a chimp there, okay? And the chimp will randomly grab any of the 3 sticks and try and get his piece of fruit, use fruit instead of a toy. And then you can show the chimp the rake and bring it back, and he'll still probably randomly grab any of the toys. So hundreds of trials later, he finally starts to use the rake. But then he'll put the rake out there, and he puts the rake with the tines up. And then maybe it's only making partial contact, and he pulls it, and he's frustrated, doesn't get the fruit. Never gets it. It needs to be contained, okay? And your 3-year-old can't explain the spatial concept of containment, but his brain is doing that unconsciously and abstractly. And I think that's the beginning of huge differences between us and the other animals. So later on, concepts such as self, life, death, episodic memories, time, events, it takes all early childhood for those to develop in the first 5 years. Kids don't really get events until 3 to 4, and then they can start telling stories about themselves and build their episodic memories, okay? And there's no evidence of any of this stuff in other animals. So now I'll get to the tool and the evolution part. This is Jacob Bronowski from the Ascent of Man, and he makes a very good point that just contemplating things alone doesn't get you anywhere, which is my beef with philosophers and religionists. The hand is more important than the eye, and I think it was very important in human evolution. The hand is the cutting edge of the mind, and I think that's what drove our brain evolution. So here's my research when I first got my PhD about 10 years ago. I did have a university position for about 4 or 5 years, and this is for my doctoral and master's research. I looked at how did kids build symmetry, and kids, adolescents, and adults, okay? And there's 3 types of symmetry. Most of you know about the first type at the bottom, bilateral symmetry, where you cut something right down the middle and you have equal halves. All of our bodies are bilaterally symmetric, right? A butterfly's wings. And you learn that in 4th or 5th grade. They teach bilateral symmetry. Unless you're a mathematician or an artist, you usually don't hear about the other 2. But the second one's probably the most important symmetry there is, and that's translational. That's the middle set, where you have equal elements at equal spaces. So you have to do 2 things. You have to be able to look at equal objects, not just sameness. Sure, animals can recognize this dog looks like another dog. They can handle sameness, but not equality. Then you have to put a frame around that space and objectify it like it's another object, because you've got to make the spaces equal as well. If you don't think translational symmetry is important to human evolution and culture, just take a look around this room. Everything in our manufactured world is translational symmetry, equal elements and equal spaces. The panels in the ceiling, the spacing of the lights, the pattern in the bricks, the blinds, even the pattern in the floor, the way the chairs are laid out with equal rows, and I can go on for an hour. Translational symmetry is huge if our brains had never figured out how to pull that spatial abstraction out. So I looked at it in child development, and then I looked at it in the archaeologic record. The first symmetry is from these kind of tools, and I will pass it around in a minute. This one happens to be from about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. We have these from about 500,000 years ago. And we've been making tools since 2,000,008. So for well over 2.5 million years, nothing like this showed up until the last 500,000 years. This doesn't happen by accident. In order to make this tool, it took an archaeologist about 35, 40 minutes. And he starts out with a haphazard shaped rock as random as this thing. And when he's done, you can end up with this fairly symmetric in plan, cross section. He can make a straight edge out of it, which is not easy. This may take a year to learn how to make. This is about a 30, 40-minute procedure. He has about 4 or 5 different types of ways he hits the stone with another stone and he chips pieces off. He's got to shape it in it. This takes some real skill. Okay? This doesn't happen by accident. This is complex enough that I think that's what really drove our conception getting off the ground. And in order to make this, you need to have some basic concepts going. So I'll show you that when we get through the rest of the symmetry, and we'll come back to this guy. So here's translational symmetry. We have bilateral at 500,000 years ago. The very first evidence of translational is 70,000 years ago. So again, another 500,000 years before we see humans being able to produce the next type of symmetry. This is an inscribed piece of ochre, and it's from Blombos Cave in South Africa. And it's got the equal lines and the equal spaces in between and the hash marks, right? It's just doodling, but it's symmetric doodling, okay? It takes another 30,000 years, 30, 40,000 years before you see it in any other tools. And you see these flying harpoons, equal elements with equal spacing. And my bird bone flute picture is gone, but you're going to see it later. About 18,000 years ago, we find the first flutes, and they've got equal holes and equal spacing, and we wouldn't have music without it. And I'll talk about music more in a little bit. The third type of symmetry is radial symmetry, which is just translational around a point. Okay? So here's the tools. I got these. I took pictures of these at the Field Museum about 10 years ago, and I'm going to pass around one that's a replica of the upper left. That upper left one is actually about 1,000,005 years old, but these go back to 2,000,008. Okay? So I'll pass this first tool around. It's very simple. All you need to do is hit about 2 or 3 hits off it, contiguous, and you get sharp flakes that you can butcher and do all kinds of things with. And then you get this really wicked chopper. But it's not very conceptually complex. Nothing like, there's no symmetry to these. We don't get any symmetry, real dedicated symmetry, for another 2.5 million years. So I'll pass them both around so you can kind of take a look at these. This is a simple stone tool, indicative of what we started making. And then this is the flying later hand axe. It's actually a replica of the one in the upper right. Okay? The two on the left are both from Olduvai Gorge, and about 1,003,000 to 1,005 years old. The 4 on the right are all from Europe, like after 100,000 years ago. And here's the picture. I think that's me. I have no idea who that handsome young guy in his 50s is. It's at least 10 years old. And I'm holding these 2 hand axes. Now, I went to study this collection knowing that there were these really nice symmetric ones from about 300,000 years ago. And that's most of what the collection is. And when you go into the back room of the museum, any of you know anything about museums, 90% of what the museum has is in the back room, right? They had shelves and shelves of these paleolithic tools from Europe. It was like amazing. They had one box, one little box marked Olduvai, and it had the site numbers on it so I could go look it up in the literature. And those hand axes I'm holding are primitive ones that are not symmetric. Those 2 things are 1.5 million years old. Still, it affects me now to think about it. It's just amazing. So what did we do when we made stone tools? And just as an aside, we've tried to teach chimps how to make tools. Chimps, again, get the idea, so they'll bash 2 rocks together, but they bash them. They hammer, okay? And they end up with a lot of dust and a lot of shit chips, and once in a while they get one big enough, that they can go cut a string and get the banana out of the box. Or they get smart and they smash it on the cement and they get chips that way. They can't do the correct flaking angle, because when you flake stone, it's a glancing blow, you gotta come in at an oblique angle, okay? And that at least is a perceptual skill that animals don't have, that we were doing 3 million years ago, but it didn't have any symmetry or anything else yet, okay? Just knock off a couple flakes. But even animals, you can't teach them to do it, okay? So two-handed competence, the way we usually work is you orient the tool in space with your left hand, which is connected to your right parietal lobe, where much of your spatial processing is. And then you, without visual guidance, hammer the stone based on feel. And that's going to be real important. I'm going to talk about embodied cognition in a minute. And I think that developed our left and right differences in our brain. That's part of the thing that developed. This is meaningful, purposeful action, and that's where language is, symmetry is, arithmetic notation, etc. is over around the language areas. I don't think that's an accident, but that's a whole other lecture. But we do this all the time. When you write, you steady the paper with your left hand and write with the right one. If you're a righty, a few people are lefty, but 90% of us are righty, okay? And you shoot pool, you steady the object and do the purposeful action with the right hand. Yes, ma'am?
If you're left-handed, is everything just?
No, in most left-handers, your brains are still left and right. There's a few people where it's flipped to the other side where you may have language in the left hemisphere. That is another whole lecture, but yeah, great question. So, in order to make that complex tool I'm passing around you, you've got to at least understand spatial things like next to, because if you're going to chip and make a straight edge, you've got to chip along that edge and keep you keep flipping the tool over and taking pieces off to make that edge even. It takes some real skill. You also have to have an idea of midline, because there's no way you can make the left and right halves equal unless you can see down the middle. You've got some kind of rudimentary, even if you don't have a word for it, left versus right, that they're somehow different. And then to get this beautiful equal bilateral symmetry, you've got to have those unobservable concepts going in your head, or you wouldn't be able to make this tool. The other thing I think that falls out of this is relative time, because there's about 4 different subroutines to make this tool, and you've got to do some things before another, and then you got to go back. I got to do this before I do that. I got to thin it before I shape it. I'm shaping it, and now there's a big thick spot here. I got to take that off before I finish the edge. You're constantly doing that, and this is like a half-hour, very complex chain of 200-300 different actions, okay? That's not just knocking a few flakes off a rock and cutting an animal open with it, okay? The other thing you have to do is you have to objectify space, okay? Because what you're doing is you're equalizing the spaces on either side of the tool, because the tool starts out just a haphazard random rock shape. You can't take equal pieces off each side to get a symmetric thing left over. You got to take a big piece off here, smaller piece off there, different piece off here, because you're making the spaces equal. That's what you're objectifying. And objectifying space, besides translational symmetry, is going to be huge for art, music, all kinds of stuff. So, equal space is equal flaking. What are we going to do next? Yeah, this is space is stupid, right? You frame a space and you make equal intervals. That's where we get number lines from, right? And we also get passage of time. We use time as a spatial metaphor, like time passes by, right? Where we have equal increments of time, either minutes or hours or seconds or whatever. They have to be equal. That's how we get our duration time, right? There's the bird bone flute, equal holes and equal spacing. You wouldn't have music without this, because what gives you rhythm is the equal spaces between the notes, okay? And the equal pitch intervals. We get into music and all that without being able to objectify spaces and make them equal. No music, no rhythm, etc. And this cave art from the far right, there's a lot of cave art, and that's a whole other lecture, Paleolithic art concepts. That's a fun one. There's a lot of geometric designs in the cave art. And if you look at the other right one, there's your translational symmetry. Equal elements, with equal spacing in between them. You kind of got that over here, the lines are the same way. So, and that's after 40,000 years, before you see a cave art. Okay, so the spaces are really important. For art, spaces are really, really important. When people could draw these lines at Chauvet Cave 32,000 years ago, right? You have to get the spaces in the neck and other things right in order for it to look right, okay? And I'll come back to events in a second. But here's what drawing skill looks like, right? When your 3-4-year-old draws, they get the features right. They know there's eyes and nose and there's arms and legs. But the spatial relationships are all wrong. It takes a lot of years for kids to learn to pay attention to the spaces. So before you can sketch as good as that art on the right, I sat in on a life drawing class when I was at the University of Kentucky, and I listened to the art instructor tell his students how important the spaces were. Because if you don't get that space between the chin and the neck right, the guy looks awkward or crooked if you don't get the spaces on the eyes right. You can tell when somebody's not that great an artist. And when somebody has this skill, they're getting the spaces right. So spaces are really important. Here's another thing we do. We put a frame around an action and call it an event. An action that happens in a specific interval of time. So baking a cake, going to the store, getting dressed, things your kids learn, have a beginning, the middle, and then it's over. And an end. I don't think your dog has any clue what going to the store is, or baking a cake is, or anything else like that. Okay? And they also understand the spaces, the time in between events. I'm getting dressed now, we're going to go to the store later. There's a space in between. Okay? We have to conceptualize that stuff in order to have time. Another thing about those complex tools is they require deliberate practice. The first tool I sent around, I could teach you to make it in 5 minutes. And we made them for 2.5 million years without a whole lot of change. And they did the job. But to learn to make that symmetric tool, that takes you about a year. That's some real skill. I've tried it, and you end up with a pile of gravel until you get good at it. It is not easy. That requires deliberate practice. There's a psychologist also out of Louisiana, a guy named Matt Rossano, that wrote on this a few years ago. I love his work. And he said, in order to make those tools, those symmetric tools, you had to have goal setting, you had to work on getting better, you had to self-monitor how you were doing, you had to practice over and over again, just like improving your tennis serve. Animals don't do this. Animals do play. A meerkat will give a scorpion to its young, and they learn how to bite the thing without getting stung, or your cat will take a mouse and lay it by the kittens, and the kittens learn to make the net bite. But that's it. They don't learn anything else. They don't practice it, okay? But humans, we deliberately practice to try and get better and more skilled. Well, that takes consciousness. That takes a conscious sense of self and being able to maintain your attention. Okay, so there's another nice piece to this. A lot of the research of the last 30 years has shown animals make all kinds of tools. Fantastic research. And a lot of people said, well, there it goes, animals make tools, so they're just like us, there's no difference. Huge difference. It's not a quantitative difference, it's qualitative. Animals that are very clever, chimps and crows are among the top two, okay, can make one tool. And it's something they do in the wild. And we put them in the lab, and they can do something really elaborate. So that crow can learn to bend a paperclip and fish a piece of food out of a curved tube. And it's really impressive. But that's all he can do. He can't teach or learn any other tools. And chimps can learn to crack nuts. But the chimps that crack nuts in West Africa don't know how to fish for termites. And the termite fishers 700 miles away, they know how to do that, but they don't know how to crack nuts. It's an empirical thing that the troop learns, and they learn by watching, and it takes 7 years for them to learn how to crack nuts. Okay, you can teach your 5-year-old in about 2 months. Okay? So there's no real manufacturing. They alter objects, but they don't make, stone spears with, hafted onto a wood thing or a bow and arrow. Nothing like that in the animal kingdom. It's one tool, one use. Okay. Here's the embodied cognition part. One of the things I think developed out of hitting those things is we got the feel, okay? Because you hold the tool in one hand, you hit it with a glancing blow with the other. But when you hammer, what do you look at? The hammer or the nail? You look at the nail. You don't visually guide the hammer on its way down, right? You're looking at where it's going. You let your body, your parietal lobe, run all this skilled action, and you feel it right. I had two archaeologists making these tools, and the one guy was telling a story that when he was training the other guy, the teacher went in the other room, and he heard the other guy chipping away, and then he heard it get real quiet. And he was like, okay, he's trying to really hit a glancing, thinning blow. And if you do it wrong, you'll snap the tool in half. So to drive a flake all the way across that really nice tool I passed around, that's some real skill, okay? And he said he hit it, ping, and the guy in the other room didn't see him, but he heard it, and he goes, oh, you nailed it. And he knew it was good, okay? So just like the home run hitter, right? He hits the ball, he doesn't even look, he sets the bat down, it's gone, it's out of here, I can feel it, right? Sweet spot kind of thing. Well, that came out of a couple million years of doing this. Mimesis just means where we can do emotional things and demonstrate emotional concepts with our body, dance, drama, things like that. Imitation gesture. I just showed a picture of the human hand with the time grip, and I want to show you the difference between a human and a chimp hand. The chimp hand is a very different primate-like hand. Our hand changed way back with Lucy, and then a couple million years of stone tool stuff when we got to where our brains changed. I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. I want to get to cognitive development. Is a newborn conscious? I got a 2-week-old today, granddaughter. She's awake, aware, alert, and responsive, but it's going to be a couple months before she even responds to her own name. It'll take her 2 years before she recognizes herself in the mirror. It'll take her 3-4 years before she can tell stories about herself and know her identity and say, I'm Joni, I'm this many. She probably get it wrong, it's 3 or 4, close enough. I'm a little girl and I have a dog named Joe. She starts building those episodic narratives. That's going to take a while. All this stuff takes all the way through infancy and toddler to develop. It doesn't just ping, happen one day, and all of a sudden your brain can do all these things. I don't think it happened that way in evolution either. So here's an 18-month-old. When they're 18 months old, they'll look for the baby behind the mirror, and they go, hi, But by the time they're 2, they know it's them. They know that's me in the mirror, okay? Chimps can do this, and orangutans and gorillas, but your dog fails at this one. And elephants, I looked that up, your dogs fail.
Some dogs.
Dogs can't do it. We'll argue about it later. Elephants were claimed to, but then I read the literature, it was 1 elephant out of 5, and it was sketchy. Dolphins probably. So here's some of the things little kids do early on, besides figuring out living from non-living when they're only a year old. 14, 18 months, 2 years, you get the all gone gesture. And the all gone gesture is a concept related to lack of containment. Something is missing. It's not in something. So you go to the kid and he holds up his juice cup and you open it and you go, where's your juice? And the kid goes, all gone, right? And then you go to look for their favorite toy in the toy box, open the toy box, it's not there, and you go, where's your toy? All gone. And then you're playing in the living room and mom leaves and the kid notices mom isn't there. A few minutes later, you go, where's mommy? All gone. What the hell is perceptually similar about those 3 instances? Absolutely nothing. That is a spatial relation, an abstract relation, that something is not in something. It's a lack of containment. There's no juice in the cup, no toy in the toy box, no mommy in the room, okay? Animals don't do this. There's no evidence that they do, but your kid does, okay? How much time have I got, Scott, when you want me to stop?
Well, we need time for questions, so I'll give you another couple minutes.
Okay, let me jump past some of these. One of the things we do with those spatial concepts is that's how we do our abstract concepts. So like I said to you, how do we visualize time? We do it by space. Time passes by. Intervals of time, right? That's how we do it. We do it based on a spatial metaphor. Here's a great metaphor about communication. This is from Steven Pinker. And it says, communication is containment and transfer. Because we say things like, we gather our ideas. No, you don't. There's no ideas sitting on the table there. It's metaphorical that you gather your ideas, you put them into words so that you get your ideas across as if I transferred something to you. And the listener can unpack my words, extract their content. there's whole books on metaphor, and almost everything we do that's abstract is based on some kind of concrete, spatial, or force metaphor. It's phenomenal stuff. I just wrote about a 4,000 word blog on this. It's going to go in a book about the theory of process. Everybody talks about theory of mind, huge literature on it in the site. Well, nobody talks about theory of process, and I think this is before theory of mind and probably more important. Your kid early on starts going, how does this work? How does it go? Right? The minute they crawl, zoom, across the living room floor to find something new, and they're fascinated by rolling the stupid marble down the ramp thing, right? They're always trying to figure out, how does this work? How does it go? That is a huge conceptual leap that you even think of, that there's some process going on, okay? And like I said, I wrote a whole blog on it. It's really interesting. And kids do this kind of stuff and nobody teaches it to them. They start to explore, then they construct, then they look for how processes work. It's really phenomenal. And humans are motivated, we're obsessed with process. How many of you know what the Large Hadron Collider is besides Paul? And a few of you, okay, this is an educated group, right? How many billions do we spend on that thing? It's insane. 30 billion, whatever it was. 10,000 scientists from every country in the world. To do what? To just figure out if the Higgs boson exists and if the standard particle model is correct or not, right? Just to figure out how the world works. We spend that much money just to figure that out, right? That's insane, but we are fascinated by that kind of thing. I think that evolved rather late, and I don't have time to go on that one. Okay, so here we're up to the present. This is a quote from Steven Pinker. Here's your 2-year-old on the smartphone, and they can figure that thing out in a heartbeat, right? And here's those notations from 18,000 years ago. The first evidence where it looks like people were tracking maybe phases of the moon and stuff. And again, that took translational symmetry to do it. Equal spaces, equal elements. And I think it all came out of the tools. And I love this, that cyberspace is the ultimate abstract realm, because you're not pushing matter around in space. You're strictly manipulating symbols and patterns. That's all you're doing. There is no desktop there, right? That icon is just a visual program thing, and you're sliding this thing over. You're not really moving something physical over. It's amazing, right? So, human relations, I'll skip this, except the only thing I want to say is the standard view in most things you'll read about human evolution, what makes us unique, is they'll talk about our social cognition. That's what drove our culture, and that's what drove our cognition. I think that's completely backwards. Okay, here's an example. Chimpanzees have constant social interactions, very Machiavellian. When they're not eating or sleeping, they are grooming each other, they're forming alliances, they're getting grudges, they're getting even with somebody, they're forming an alliance to go take this guy down, and he'll no longer be top chimp. They're deceiving one another, go off in the woods and copulate. When the main chimp is with somebody else, I'll sneak off with the lower status man. Constantly, okay? Their social interactions are huge, but they don't have any concepts, they don't have any language. None of that evolved out of their 5-6 million years of incredible social interaction. It's not social interactions you get there. And the other gripe I have about it is nobody ever proposes any theory. If you say it's because we need to talk to each other and talk to more people and larger groups of people, we have to keep track. Okay, then give me a theory of how you get from that to concepts. I haven't read one yet, okay? So I think it came out of the spatial concepts out of the tools. So here's my hypothesis. This is the end of the talk. Two-handed competence manufacturer of complex symmetric tools, not merely simple ones, produced our conceptual abilities, including spatial, force, time, eventually metaphor, and other unobservable abstract relations that every kid goes through. And from that, we develop a sense of self, episodic memory, later theory of mind, understanding other people have minds, and this theory of process. And that's what created our incredible social cognition and culture, not the other way around. So our daily stream of consciousness, right, I think is a conceptually driven, constructed model, and without our conceptual abilities of space and force, we wouldn't have objects, we wouldn't have living things or people, and we wouldn't have time, and then we couldn't make events, and we eventually wouldn't get to ourself walking through that model in our heads, and that's what our daily consciousness is. And it evolved in all these separate steps over 3 million years, and much of it evolved just in the last 500,000, maybe in the last 100,000 since we've been modern humans. So that's the story. I've got a couple pages of references because I'm an academic, so I've got to have references. And Scott asked me if I wanted to bring my first book with. I did. I'll sign a copy and sell you one for $15 if you want. The first book was a secular attack on religion. Then I'm still trying to get published. I self-published it, but I'm trying to get a publisher this year. I'm going to start a video log and try and build up enough of a following. I get a publisher to take this book and the next one when it's done and books down the road. So thank you very much for listening. I really enjoy talking about this stuff. This is, as much as trying to kick religion off a cliff, this stuff, this cognitive evolution stuff is really my passion. It's fantastic. So the opportunity to speak here is wonderful. Thank you very much.
Those of you who need to leave at, since we promised we'd be ending at 9, feel free. But if you have questions, Bill, are you willing to stick around for 15, 20 minutes?
But buy the book first.
Oh, did you pull them out, Scott?
Yeah, there's some back there.
Yeah, for $15, I got change, and I can also do a swipe card if somebody wants to. Should we do the books first and let people leave? You want to do that, or you want to do some
maybe you
10
can answer
minutes
questions.
question and answer first?
Yeah, maybe you can answer questions from, now I can take $15 if people have,
I'll give you the change. If somebody does have a credit card, I have a swiper there, but here's $20 at 5s. Okay. Who's questions? Howard?
Well, Bill, I'm a little confused. I'm trying to make sure, I thought I heard you at the beginning saying that our social interaction, as far as how we interact with everybody else, came after our development of cognition. Is that
Yes, much of the way we interact as family and kin.
Okay, but through the rest of your discussion, you talked about the primate social skills, the chimps, other grades. Why wouldn't our social interactions as humans have evolved from the earlier interactions that we inherited from the primates?
We do have those same primate social interactions. We probably lived in small bands. We were probably polygamous like primates back with Lucy. There's huge sections of dimorphism back with Lucy. The males are huge and the females are little. That tells you how their mating patterns were. So do we have all that primate stuff? Yes. But you got 6 million years of that chimp evolution. They don't have any of our concepts, language, or culture. Okay?
That's different from social skills.
Yes, what I'm saying is it didn't deduce any of that. The standard view is that our social interactions gave us our concepts and gave us our conceptual consciousness. And nobody proposes just how that happened. Everybody just assumes that. I'm saying, no, that's backwards. Okay? Our type of social interaction that we take as normal in our modern culture probably just showed up in the last 100,000 years. Even in cave art, there's a lot of weird clues in the cave art. You saw those lions from Chauvet. Those people could draw, some of them. There's a lot of cave art that's total crap. Okay, you don't see that in the coffee table book. So there's just as much lousy art as there is coffee table art, right? Anybody that could draw that lion like that, they could draw close to the Mona Lisa or do some excellent portraiture. There are no pictures of human faces. There's occasionally a stick figure of a human, and that's it. And they're rare. Out of 300-400 cave art and rock shelter sites, there's a handful of human stick figures. Yet they could do that. I don't think they looked at one another the way we would think we would. You can't assume they had our psychology of romantic love or ideas of family. They lived in family bands. I didn't get to this in the talk, but a guy named Richard Wrangham thinks we've been cooking since about 2 million years ago, and that would have caused some of the social grouping different than a chimp. And it didn't come from the chimp social things. It came from cooking and preparing foods, and the men go out and hunt and gathering and all that kind of stuff. that there's a lot of social changes there, but it doesn't mean it was conceptual. And that's what's different. And you can have very intricate social interactions without any concepts, because that's what chimps do, okay? So that can all be built in, but it can be nothing like our human consciousness. You gotta get to the concepts first. And it looks like spatial concepts are the base of all our conceptual stuff. And that's the way it happens in child development.
There's a difference between built-in and built-on.
Okay. Yeah. I agree, but I don't think our primate social interactions got us anywhere. It doesn't get you to spatial concepts. Okay? And the other thing is, there's no evidence of huts, no evidence of villages until the last couple 100,000 years. It's really recent. So how they were living at 1 million or 2 million years ago might have been pretty similar to a chimp trip, except they were making these tools and butchering animals, maybe using thrusting spears to kill big animals, but no symmetry, okay? No complex tools like harpoons and bows and arrows. Those don't show up until 20,000 years ago. Really, really late. And then you don't get tribal stuff until about 10,000 years with the Neolithic. Then you get civilizations and everything we think of as modern culture. And you get tools and you get water wheels just in the last 3,000 years. Okay, it's all real recent. So what kind of social interactions they had back then, okay, there's not much evidence for anything like how we live. Okay? And I don't think there's any way to get there. Plus, I've never seen anybody propose it. I would love to see somebody propose a theory. Well, social interactions will get you to these concepts or spatial concepts or whatever, and nobody, it's not there. It's not.
So what, I don't know the answer, I don't know if you do, but what's going to happen in the future? And what makes me wonder is it took so many years to learn these skills until they, to learn how to make an arrowhead.
Sure.
And then it became easy to teach it, but at first it wasn't. It was by chance. So what's going to happen now? The things that we try really hard to learn and think through?
You mean like manual skills?
I mean like our minds, like say 1,000 years from now. Could there possibly be some new kinds of cognition that we don't know about?
Usually evolution takes longer than 1,000 years. I don't mean evolution for humans has stopped.
Yeah, that's what
But then I also don't buy much of what futurists predict, because they're usually totally wrong. There's just too many stochastic things that happen that you can't predict. But our modern environment is also selecting for us too, right? We don't need brawn anymore. Nobody farms anymore. Very few people hunt anymore, right? So what's it selecting for, right? People with good eyesight and ability to sit in front of a computer for 20 hours, right? And amass lots of information, right? That's our environment that we've created that is now, it's a different selecting pressure. So is human evolution over? Hell no. But are we in a different environment of our own creation? Yeah, way different than 99% of our existence. The civilization, and now our modern technological civilization is it's going through the roof. Where it's going to go, I can't answer that.
Is it speeding up?
Technology, yeah. If you listen to people like Peter Diamandis, you know who he is, or Ray Kurzweil, all the futurists. I think Kurzweil's half full of crap, but that's okay. He's correct, and so are the others, that our technology is just going exponential. If you think things have changed fast, just wait another 10 years of this stuff. We think this shit's normal. We all grew up without these. We all grew up with payphones and party lines and stuff, right? The kids think this is normal. This is Star Trek. Are you kidding? Right? And now we're used to it too. And what's it going to look like 10 years from now? Right? What else is it going to replace? How many gadgets did this replace from the 70s? Your VHS, your alarm clock, your calculator. No one used to buy a sharp calculator for $200 in 1970. Now you got an app on here for nothing. Unbelievable.
Well, on the same vein, I don't know how many people had the same experience. As a child, I watched the Jetsons. Yeah, and the phone, video phone,
Yep.
where she gets up in the morning and she's getting a call. Oh my gosh, she puts on a fake thing so she can do it. I thought that'll never happen. We'll never.
And 10 years
Get
ago,
that.
you would pay hundreds of dollars an hour for teleconferencing. Now you're gonna Skype and FaceTime for nothing.
All over the world. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah.
Another thing the futurists talk about that isn't BS, there's about 3.5 billion people on these things right now or on the internet. And a few years ago, they were predicting we'd get another 2 billion online in 5-10 years. Now they're talking in 5 to 10 years, the other 3.5 billion people on the planet are going to be on this thing. That within another 5 to 10 years, everybody on the planet is going to be connected on this thing. Or something like, they're even talking about that Apple and Amazon and people are saying that they can make a basic phone for like 25 or 50 bucks. They're not even going to charge people, they're just going to give them to people. Why? Because they're going to get the Amazon sales, right? So that they may just go to the developed countries and nobody's going to buy a phone for $100 in a contract. They're going to hand it to them because they want them on the net and they want them connected, right? And they're going to put GPS all around the world that there will be no blind spot. That's going to be amazing, really good. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question that goes backwards in time.
Oh, love it.
I was wondering what you thought might be the impetus behind significant leaps in the sophistication of tool development, like the 500,000 years ago, the change to symmetrical, and then...
I think, from what I know of genetics and brain evolution, and that's advancing too, is that mutations happen all the time. And common mutations in the brain would be extra copies of things just get copied in your genome. So if you're a hominid at 500,000 years ago and you're making a hand axe, but it's not very symmetric, right? If your kid is born and he's got another column of neurons in his brain, right, in his parietal lobe, that are because of a copy number variation in normal genetics. And now this kid can see symmetry. And now you're in the right environment where now this symmetry can mean something. And then somehow that symmetry also got into our dopamine reward system. We love symmetry, okay? We do. We like things to be symmetric. Like 25% of OCD patients, their issues aren't safety or contamination. It's order and balance and symmetry. And that they don't arrange their shit just right, they're bothered. And most of us don't like that. That's actually a common thing in the general population. I do this with my students, right? You're at a restaurant. How many of you, if you see a picture kind of caught in a restaurant, it'll bug you, and you might even, when you go to the bathroom, you go straight to that. How many of you will do that, right? What the hell do you care? You may never be to that restaurant again. It doesn't make you safe. It doesn't make you warm. It doesn't protect you from anything. Why is that wired into your pleasure system? Right? And a colleague of mine said, well, it's just control. Well, it's control. You take the thing off, set it on the ground, and you turn it upside down, or you cock it the other way and go. That's not what anybody does. You straighten it because it bugs you that the spaces aren't equal and it's nice and aligned. Okay, so symmetry is huge in our life. Was it a common brain mutation? I'm thinking that's the way it's gone, but I haven't written anything theoretical on that yet. The only example I can give you is, you all know about lactose intolerance, right? Some populations can't drink milk. Our lactose gene, lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose milk sugar, usually shuts off at age 5, which is about the time we wean, okay? So most people as adults couldn't process milk sugar once you got past age 5. They now know that that gene mutated 2-3 times in Africa, a couple times in Northern Europe. So pastoral populations that had goats and sheep and cattle, right? That gene conferred an advantage. It may have evolved dozens of times over the last 2 million years, but nobody was around milk, right? So it just went away. But when it evolves in the right environment, all of a sudden it's advantageous. And now you've got a dozen populations around the world with different genes that keep the lactase gene turned on and they can drink milk and cheese and all that, right? So I'm thinking something like that could happen in the brain, because the brain did expand tremendously from 1,000 cc's to about 1,600 cc's over the last billion years, that if you get a copy repeat of a column of neurons in a certain part of the brain, all of a sudden the brain can recognize something else or do something else, possibly symmetry or equalness or whatever, and that's all over in our left parietal lobe that did expand pretty dramatically with language.
Is there any evidence that pressure for more efficient hunting might have played a part in it. Changing animal populations.
Yes, okay, the Ice Age hunters. I just read an archaeologist who thinks, and he's a noted archaeologist, he thinks that most of the tool use the first couple of million years was not habitual. It was kind of occasional. They made a tool when they needed it. But the last couple 100,000 years, they used them every day, like those symmetric hand axes, and they made spear points. Prior to that, they made thrusting spears out of wood, like a long pike. And you can skewer an animal and it's tough, okay? But by the time of the Ice Age hunters, it depended on nothing but these big game mammals, and that's what the cave art is full of. And it's full of pictures of animals speared with darts. That instead of it, they didn't have a bow and arrow. What they had is an atlatl. It's a spear thrower, and they made this long dart and they put a stone tip on it. Okay, so that pressure to learn to half that tool, you could whip this thing better than throwing a spear, trying to run up to the animal and thrust it and try and run away before the animal gets you, right? You could hit that thing from 20 yards away, and if you get a heart-lung shot, it's going to die pretty quickly and you're going to meal. So there's strong hunting pressure, and when I talk about the Paleolithic art and concepts talk, I get into some of that. So that could be one piece as well. The pressure is, it's tough with pressure because for 2.5 million years, that crappy little stone tool I gave you, it was good enough. It did great. The sharp flake and the chopper, it didn't change for 2.5 million years. Why? And people, archaeologists used to say, why didn't they get smarter? Well, they didn't need to. It worked. It was a great adaptation. We left Africa and populated all of Asia. We did it again in 1.8 million with better hand axes, and we did it again after 200,000 years with all the tools I've showed you. So if something works in evolution, there may not be pressure to change it. It's good for 1 million years or whatever, or 500,000 years, right? So sometimes, pressure, it may have been more of a random brain mutation that gave us symmetry and stuff. I haven't pursued that far enough because I haven't found a neurologist to tell me. How would the brain evolve? How, is it copy numbers of genes and you get a new column? That's one of my thoughts, but I haven't read any great theory on that yet.
Do you think we're going to survive another 100 years? I mean, evolution is so slow, and we've got, we're ignoring climate change. We've got nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
One North Korea thing, and
but I would guess 7.5 billion people on the planet, a couple 100,000, maybe 1 million. 100 million, billion might survive. We might wipe out a lot of this if we screwed up with the nuclear exchange. I'm with you on that. And climate change is going to be a mess. Coastal cities, like Miami, are already, despite what Trump says, his managers at Mar-a-Lago are buying more pumps and dealing with flooding streets. They know what climate change is all about, right? So I don't think we're going to disappear in 100 years because I've been hearing doomsday since the end of World War II. Don't you remember when we were little, we put our heads under the desk for the nuclear bomb thing? What the hell good was that for, right? Well, how was that going to save anyone? But we thought World War III was around the corner when I was a kid, and we've had 75 years of peace because of more democracies and the mutual assured destruction. So hopefully Trump and Kim Jong-un don't screw it up, right?
I was wondering, you talked about using the hand tools. If I look at my hands, I notice that there's actually 2 different parts of it. There's the grasping part, which is the last 2, and then there's a manipulating part, which is the top 3.
Yes.
Now, is that true in apes? Do apes have that same differentiation?
Apes have incredible dexterity.
Yeah, but
if you go back to that,
do they have this?
Do we have time, Scott, for me to back up to the picture?
People will leave when they want.
There's the ape hand, okay? If you want to know what it's like to have an ape hand, pretend your fingers are about 3 inches longer, and your thumb only goes up to your first knuckle, and it's no bigger than your pinky. See that little tiny thumb? Okay, the ape hand is for brachiating through the trees, and then they knuckle walk. Apes can't make this grip. Their fingers don't go across. That's number 1. So that was a great question. 2, they don't have this huge pad of meat that you and I are used to. It's flat. They don't grip very well. They can throw, but not terribly accurately, and they'll throw shit into each other and stuff, but they're not real good at it, and they never practice. But their hands aren't built, so we've tried to teach a chimp to chip tools and make at least that simple chopper, and he can't even make that. He'll tend to bash them together, because he gets the idea, I gotta break a chip off. And he'll bash and make a lot of dust and a lot of chips, and then he gets whatever. Now, they do have fine dexterity. If you ever watch a chimp manipulate fruit or, a small insect, right? They have incredible manipulation powers. Primates are the only animals that can reach out in their environment, right? Grab something, and instead of sniffing it like a rat or a raccoon, they visually inspect it, and then, ooh, that's ripe fruit, I'll eat it, right? And then they can put it back in the environment in the same spot. So they do have good dexterity, but their hand is very, very different than even Lucy's. And there were no stone tools with Lucy's. The idea is she was probably using digging sticks and developed that at the time, because her hand was 80 to 90% human, and still had some curved fingers that were different. It was about 80, 90% there. Shall we call it a night?
All right.
Awesome.